guest this afternoon, Stephen Cohen. Thank you for coming.
Well, that was an introduction, and if I could get it notarized and take it with me, or take you with me, can I put this down? The only problem with the introduction is that's pretty much my talk. So we can go right to the conversations. Actually, I'm really happy to be here. I've never been to Carnegie before. Actually, I don't get invited many places anymore, much for the reason that Joanne Myers mentioned. Somebody said to me when I said I was happy to be someplace the other day, that as long as you've been around, you ought to be happy to be any place. But I am happy to be here. When Joanne called me and said there was something called Author in the Morning, I thought it was impossible because I am a very nocturnal person. I've been up about 3 hours. But I will be up. When you all go to sleep, I'll still be up working. The other reason I'm happy to be here is that I just finished my course at NYU, 300 students. The course is called Russia Since 1917. And as I look around the room, I am very happy that everybody here was born before 1991. When I started teaching about Russia at Princeton, I was a relatively young man, and my undergraduates were about 10 years younger than me. Some of them, if they were, I think I was 28, and some of them 21 even. So we had some historical reference points in common. And we lived through a lot of intense history during the almost 30 years I was at Princeton. Now, I can't be sure what they've ever heard of, and I don't say that as a joke, it's just that it gets harder and harder to teach. You say Gorbachev, and there's a kind of, yeah, I've heard that someplace, though we all lived through that, it's part of our lives. So what's autobiographical for us? As I look around the room, I don't want to include anybody in that that doesn't want to be included, but is history for them. And it's no longer clear to me exactly where history and contemporary affairs begins anymore. And you always got to keep that in mind. But I think I don't have that problem here. I want to talk today, because I think that's what's of interest about, particularly since President Obama has reframed the issue, about American-Russian relations. But since it is a book event, I will take just a few minutes to give you a sense of what the book is about and how it relates to the subject of American-Russian relations, which I'll then get to. This book is the first, but it turns out not to be the last, because I'm working on, just finished another book that is co-autobiographical with my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, about our own experiences in Russia. But this is the first sort of intellectually autobiographical book I ever wrote, because all the themes in the book are all the themes of my intellectual and personal engagement with Russia that now is in 40-some-odd years. I became a graduate student in the 1960s. And over the years, I've lived there a lot and seen a lot and studied a lot and written a lot. They are, these chapters, as Joanne said, about different turning points in modern Russian Soviet history, but what unites them is my abiding interest in alternatives. And not just Russian, but that's what I know best, that when a society, an elite, a leader, a country come to a crossroads, and that's what history's full of, is crossroads. Why do they take one road and not the other, especially if this is a fateful crossroad that's going to affect the future of that country and maybe the world? I think, because somebody asked me to think about this once, I first got interested in alternatives growing up in Kentucky. Is Joan here? Joan, are you here? Joan's not here. She grew up in Louisville. I grew up in a segregated, where are you, Joan? Oh, there you are. Hi. I don't know, I'm much older than you, but you may have some memory of this. Completely segregated town, small town in Kentucky, where people of my generation took segregation for granted. It was a natural way of things. And then when you get older, you realize something's wrong. And then a teacher told me that during the Civil War, the presidents of both the Union and the Confederacy hailed from Kentucky, Jefferson Davis and Lincoln. So I figured if two guys came from Kentucky and took different roads, there must have been a crossroads in racial history in Kentucky's history. So I got interested in it. But then I fell in the hands of Russia when I went to Indiana University to study. But I took that theme of alternatives and crossroads with me, and I've stuck with it all these years. It's about the only thing historical that I write about. It's a contrarian theme, as is the book, because the idea that there were turning points and roads that didn't have to be taken in Soviet history is not popular in my field and never has been. So I've been something of an intellectual outsider, not alone. There have been 2 or 3 of us at any given moment. But it's been a minority perspective that things didn't have to turn out for better or worse, but usually worse in Soviet history, as they did. Now, when Gorbachev came to power, almost exactly, if you all remember, I don't have to say this to, you can't say that in a class of students, as you all remember, almost 25 years ago, March 1985, 25 years ago, as the drama of his reforms unfolded, I see Ed Klein, the president of the Sakharov Foundation there, and Ed and I had worked together with dissidents for many years, and when Gorbachev called up Sakharov in exile and said, come on home, go back to work, I mean, Ed and I were just looking at each other. I mean, this was something one might dream of it, but did one expect to see it in one's lifetime? Well, Ed and I did, but not many people did. The point here is Gorbachev reintroduced the idea of alternatives. It looked like something was going to unfold in the Soviet Union people hadn't expected. So the subject became popular, and I became popular with it briefly. And with the end of Gorbachev, the field, and along with it the media to a certain extent, reverted to the view that almost everything that had happened, including the end of the Soviet Union, had to happen, either because of the communist ideology or because of the nature of Russia. That was the main division in the field. Are they terribly bad because of communism, or are they terribly bad because of Russia? And there wasn't much wiggle room to get out of that, but we tried with our students. So once again, the idea of alternatives isn't popular. And in fact, I was reading not long ago one explanation of why the Soviet Union ended, and the author, a very eminent senior person, said the Soviet Union died for a lack of alternatives. It's catchy, but if you take it literally, for a historian, it's preposterous. I mean, or there are always alternatives, some good, some bad. So in the book, what I try to do is show that at the most fateful moments in Soviet history, the rise of Stalin, which would lead to the terror, the fall of Khrushchev, which would end the reformation of the Stalinist system for 20 years, the end of Gorbachev and of the Soviet Union, that at each of these moments, there was an alternative. Now, this is not what's become popular, and I actually like it, but I don't do it. What if history? What if Hitler died in a Bavarian beer hall? What would happen? Or what if the assassination of the leader of the Leningrad Communist Party organization in December 1934, which set off the blood purges, had been instead the assassination of Stalin? Would the same thing have happened? These are useful to check your own assumptions about what you think causality is. But I do something different. I take actual existing situations. Nothing's made up. Here was a struggle, a real issue, a real moment, real people, real political forces behind them, real segments of society supporting this course or that course. And I ask, why did one and not the other prevail? I don't want to say that my explanations are persuasive. If you take the reaction of my field, they're not persuasive, but they provoke discussion, and in a field where discussion isn't the most vigorous aspect of the field, this type of thing, I think it's useful, and students at least ask the questions. Also, thinking about alternatives in Russian history gives you some sense of how Russians think about their own history, because when my wife Katrina and I sit around, and we have in Russia since the early 80s, in kitchens and then in public forums, and now again in kitchens. This is what people talk about. Why did it happen? Could it have been different? Who's responsible? What are the alternatives? And that conversation is useful. So what I do in the book, for example, is in the first chapter, I look at a man named Nikolai Bukharin, who was the Soviet state founding father who most of all represented an alternative to Stalin. He was against the collectivization of the peasantry, in a word, in the further development of the Soviet system. And I find him in that chapter in prison awaiting trial and execution in 1937. Those of you who remember Arthur Koestler's novel, Darkness at Noon, Rubashov, Koestler's protagonist, was based on Bukharin. Or at least Koestler thought so. He got some things wrong. But, that's how Bukharin was remembered. And now we have discovered archive documents in Stalin's archive that tells us what Bukharin was writing and thinking and doing in that prison before they shot him for a year. So I do two things. I go to into the cell with the material, and I reopen the question of what in Russia is known as the Bukharinist alternative to Stalin. Was it feasible to leave the peasants, 82% of the population in 1929 when this happened, as free farmers and not herd them into state farms? So I look at that alternative. Then I go to the other end of this story, because it seems to me that the forcible collectivization of the peasantry led in some way to Stalin's 25-year mass terror in the country, the political terror. I go then to the death of Stalin and the moment when his successor, Khrushchev, decides to let the survivors of Stalin's terror out of the gulag, of prisons, concentration camps, exiles, and go home. Lots of them didn't have any homes to go to. Many had been away too long. But they were survivors. And I wanted to know, because Katrina and I knew in the early 80s and later quite a few people who were still alive who had come home in the 50s and 60s. They had told us their stories. But I wanted to tell their story, but use the story in this way, that if Khrushchev took such a daring act, he was serious about the reformation of the Stalinist system. And he obviously thought that releasing the victims was a step toward de-Stalinizing the system, and it was, but it also led to Khrushchev's overthrow. It was just too much. Now, he had gotten old. He was 70. Is that old? I'm not sure. But he wasn't in great shape when he was overthrown. But this is what precipitated it. His colleagues had simply had enough. A lot of them were implicated in these crimes. But I ask, what happened to the reformation that Khrushchev began, and why did it have to wait 20 years for Gorbachev? Many Russians today believe that had the Khrushchev reforms been continued by Khrushchev or somebody else, it would have reformed the Soviet Union in a way that it would still exist. Separate question. Then I come to Gorbachev, and I have 3 chapters in the book about the Gorbachev's reform. And here I come to 3 contrarian conclusions, as Joanne said. First is, it's not correct that the Soviet Union was unreformable. In 5 years, Gorbachev carried out reforms that no one thought possible, even those of us who had believed before that it was reformable. I mean, to the point of democratization. Secondly, that you can't say meaningfully in historical terms that Gorbachev failed, because he did 2 things of historic importance. First, he took Russia, which had existed 1,000 years as a state, closer to real democracy than it had ever been in its history. And I would add, though people don't agree with me, closer to democracy than it's been ever since, because I think it's been de-democratization since shortly after the end of the Soviet Union. But leave that aside. That's a remarkable achievement. And along with President Reagan, all credit due, he brought all of us closer to the end of the Cold War, and maybe they ended the Cold War, that's a question, than anybody had thought possible. So to speak of failure is not exactly right. Obviously, he failed in the sense that he lost his country, but he left something behind that was absolutely historic. And I don't think the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I think it was abolished. And I make an argument that to call it collapse misses what actually happened. If you think it collapsed, you expect certain things to happen afterward. If you think it was abolished in pursuit of property, you would expect other things to happen, which have happened, the looting of the country. But that, again, is a separate story. And then that brings me to the topic today and to the 7th chapter of my book, which I call Who Lost the Post-Soviet Peace? Now, had I been clever, or cleverer than I am, I would have left it at that. Who lost the post-Soviet peace? But I go on to speak of a new Cold War, which a lot of people have objected to. I can make a case that we've been living in either a new or renewed or continued Cold War since 1992, but it doesn't really matter. It's just that the relationship went south very quick and very badly. It got worse and worse and worse. And in the book, I ask why that happened. And I make the argument, again, well, let me back up. Since it became part of the American consensus that relationship had gotten bad, and that didn't happen until about 6, 7 years ago, the answer why it got bad was one word: Putin. It was good before Putin, and it got bad after Putin. I argue that that's not what happened, that the bad relationship, or the new Cold War, began to unfold in Washington in the 1990s under the Clinton administration. All apologies to people who worked for or feel sentimental about the Clinton administration, but it was a big administration with lots of people making their contributions, some for and some against this policy. But about 17 years ago, the United States adopted a set of policies that almost inevitably, nothing's inevitable, led to a very bad relationship. And that therefore, because this new Cold War began in Washington, averting it, changing it, had also to begin in Washington. The Russians were simply too aggrieved, too bitter, and no Russian leader could have gotten the political support, which you still have to do in Russia, to enact a turnabout in Russian policy. And therefore, I was very excited when Obama said, when he was running, that he was going to reset American policy. Maybe it was Biden who first said this, but Obama took it up. I was excited for two reasons. First, I thought he understood that something bad had happened and that American policy had to change course, and that the reset was essential. Now, it's important at this point, though, to tell you the historical nature of my argument about how things got this bad. And Jack Matlock was here, what, about a month or two ago? All right. So if you all listen to what Ambassador Matlock, he was Reagan's ambassador during the Gorbachev years, and maybe one of the finest ambassadors that America ever had. Ambassadors are defined by his or her times, not in the abstract, but an ambassador who reacted to what history required. Jack was certainly among the greatest. And you've heard part of this from Jack, because he and I are the only two people in the United States who speak in public who have this point of view. The 40-year Cold War was ended by Gorbachev, Reagan, and the first President Bush sometime between 1988 and 1990. Now, there have been a lot of conferences of people who were participants in the so-called end of the Cold War, and they disagree whether it ended in 1987 when Gorbachev and Reagan abolished an entire category of nuclear weapons, never been done since. 1988, when Reagan walked onto Red Square, Katrina and I were there, horribly hot day in July, and when asked if this was the evil empire, he said, no, it's not the evil empire anymore. Whether that marked the end of the Cold War, or whether it was at Yalta in December, I mean not Yalta, Malta, in December 1989, when Bush, the first Bush and Gorbachev said the Cold War was over. But Reagan had written in his diary when he left office in January 1989, the Cold War's over. He thought it was over. Why do I emphasize this? Because it ended by any count at least 2 years before the Soviet Union ended. Those two events are now conflated in the history books, certainly in the high school history books, and to a certain extent in the college textbooks, with implications for what our children understand and what our policymakers think they understand. The second point is that the Cold War, if it ended, was ended by negotiation, not force of arms, not economic collapse. And it was ended, as Condi Rice, who participated in, she was then working for Scowcroft, who was the first Bush's national security advisor, wrote in her diary, it ended without winners or losers. No winners, no losers. That was correct. And it didn't seem to have ended, because you will remember what happened in 1990-91. The two sides, Moscow and Washington, actually against what London and Paris wanted, Thatcher was against it, reunited Germany. I mean, that would certainly be a sign of the Cold War. That was the epicenter of the Cold War, right? So if the two sides had. And secondly, the first post-Cold War war was the Gulf War, the first war against Saddam, who had been a client of the Soviet Union. The Gorbachev Soviet Union essentially supported Bush's war against Saddam to drive Saddam out of Kuwait. So you would say, well, yes, I mean, clearly the Cold War is over, or so it seems. But then something happened. When the Soviet Union ended in December of 1991, the American political policy media establishment rewrote the history and declared America won the Cold War. And that has become the orthodox narrative. Now, the political policy result of that, almost immediately, I speak now of the early 90s, was now to view Russia, as had emerged from the Soviet Union, as what? A defeated nation. And since our only paradigm of war remains World War II, Munich and all that, Policymakers began to think of Russia as analogous to Germany and Japan after World War II, supplicant nations, defeated nations, which had implications for policymaking. And this became the revisionist, triumphalist view and the basis of American policy. Under Clinton, it carried on through the second Bush, and that policy was still in place when President Obama became president in January 2009. These policies generated what I call the new Cold War. If you don't want to call it a new Cold War, it's okay, but these policies generated the deterioration, very steady, in the relationship. And it had the potential to be much, much, much more dangerous. I want you to think back to August 2008, what we call the Russian-Georgian War. I don't think of it like that. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was a proxy American-Russian war. We created the Georgian regime. We created the Georgian military. We led Saakashvili, wrongly perhaps, to think that he had American NATO support for what he did, because he did, and he was the first to fire. And American military minders were traveling with the Georgian forces. Now, what did this mean? Well, those of us who have some memory know that never except in Cuba did we ever come so close to an eyeball-to-eyeball military confrontation with Russia. And this occurred not in Berlin, not in the Third World in Ethiopia where there were these proxy wars, but right on Russia's borders. And we now know, I didn't know it at the time, but we now know two things. That Cheney presented a plan to Bush urging NATO intervention in the war, that NATO should come in on the side of the Georgians. And we also know that the Russians took this seriously enough, at least this is what German intelligence says, to think that if NATO came in, it may go nuclear. And therefore, the Russians rolled their missile launchers into Ossetia, where the war was being fought in Georgia, not with warheads, but to put them in position. Now, this isn't good. This is very bad. This had all the potential to be a Cuban Missile Crisis again. And yet, nobody noticed. Nobody noticed. Whoever you think was to blame, let's say the Russians were to blame. Let's say Saakashvili was to blame. Let's say God was to blame. The point is that the relationship after the end of the Soviet Union led to this. And it's going to lead to the same sort of thing, maybe worse things, unless American policy changed. And this was the situation that Obama inherited when he became president. So, how has Obama done with the reset? How has he done? Has he averted a new Cold War with Russia? In three respects, he's done very well, I would say. He's established, President Obama has, a friendly working relationship with Russian President Medvedev. And they've done so on the basis of generational affinity. They're both going on about what young, hot guys they are and how they got to get together and lead the world to a better place, and on their affinity as exceedingly weak leaders at home. When Obama went to meet Medvedev, he was plunging in the polls. Congress had rebelled against him. He had lost control of his own party. And Medvedev, of course, was in the shadow of Putin. So they needed each other. A little foreign policy success, as every American president discovers along the way, is good for the poll numbers to a certain extent. So they've developed this relationship. It's not a bad thing. Secondly, the general atmosphere has clearly improved. There's less talk about Cold War-like conflicts, less villainization of the other side, and more talk of cooperation. And thirdly, Obama, and this is the one tangible thing he did, he revived the arms control reductions process that had existed for 40 years that the second Bush simply jettisoned. And any sensible person would say, good gosh, anything they can do to make us safer in a nuclear world is a good thing. So it's a very imperfect agreement, but it's a good thing, better than nothing. So it seems to me these are all three significant developments. And the situation's better than it was when Obama came power, but, or as Russians say, однако, however. The reset, and thus the relationship with Russia, is exceedingly fragile and vulnerable because 5 fallacies, or I would call them conceits, that were characteristic of the Clinton-Bush era Russia policy remain elements to some degree, it's hard to be sure to what degree, of the policy of the Obama administration. 5. First, the administration is still meddling in Russia's internal political affairs. This is a no-no among great powers, but we've been doing it in Russia since 1992. We see this. Obama still talks about democracy promotion, but one feels his heart's not in it, but he has to do it for constituency reasons. There's a State Department budget for it, and all the rest. But the real thing they've done that is a mistake is they've tried to play, as they put it, the Medvedev card against Putin. Putin's a bad guy, Medvedev's a good guy, he's our guy, he's our horse, we'll ride him. First of all, this is misinformed about the situation in Russia. Medvedev's not even a horse yet. He may become a horse, but at the moment there's only one real horse running this race. But secondly, the Russian political class sees what they're doing and they resent it. They don't like it. Even Merkel, who's close to Putin, complained to Washington about this, told him to stop it. It was demeaning to everybody to be doing this. But it's a reflex. Secondly, there is still Washington's presumption that Russia is weak, and we don't have to treat it as a great power, and that if Russia wants to be meaningful in the world affairs, it needs the United States. And this is what we were told by Vice President Biden on 3 very publicized occasions. When he went to Georgia, to Tbilisi, right after Obama left Moscow last July with Medvedev, and basically said Russia is a spent power, it's a dying nation, we don't have to negotiate with them. People said, that's old Joe running his mouth, but it wasn't. It was a scripted speech, and it reappeared 2 weeks later as an interview in the Wall Street Journal. So this is the position of a powerful faction in the Obama administration. Is it Obama's position? I have no idea. But it's certainly Biden's position. So is this view that Russia isn't serious, we don't have to take it into account? I would argue, however, in fact, that arguably, I'm not going to go into why, but if you want to talk about it, let's do, that in terms of national security, the United States needs Russia more than Russia needs us. Secondly, that all the recent great power skirmishes between the United States and Russia have been won by Russia. Have been won by Russia. Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan. It's not a turf friendly to the United States for the fighting of a Cold War. It's Russia's turf. Leave aside the geography. There's intermarriage, there's language, there's cultural affinity, and all the rest. And thirdly, something's happened in Moscow that's not noted, or if it's noted in Washington, they don't care. Moscow doesn't really care about us very much anymore. We have become for Russia what Russia used to be for us, a problem to manage, but not a priority. What matters for Russia? Berlin, Beijing. These are the 2 most important emerging bilateral relationships in the world, and I don't think anybody told Washington. It's called the Eurasian Policy. Russia sits in Europe, Russia sits in Asia, Beijing's in Asia, Berlin's in Europe. This is what we do. America's not a European country, America's not an Asian country, and America doesn't have a policy, it has mood swings when it comes to Russia. And therefore, there's nothing we can do about it. We have to manage the nuclear problem with them, but else, well, what do we need them for? They're not even a trading partner of any consequence with us. Third, there's still the post-Soviet American conceit of the 90s that Russia cannot have a legitimate national interest that's different from America's national interest. And where we see this most vividly is in the case of Iran. Russia does not want Iran to become a nuclear country. For one thing, Iran might be able to develop short-range missiles that could hit Moscow. It probably would be years before it could put a warhead on a transatlantic missile. They're more worried about it than we are. But Russia has a completely different geopolitical problem with Iran. First of all, it lives near Iran. And in its other areas, it just sees NATO coming at it. It can't afford another unfriendly country, and a big one. Secondly, Russia has about 20 million Islamic citizens of its own. Over the last years, as you all know, from terrorism to civil wars, Russia's had a major problem with violent Islamic radicalism. Not once, ever, in these years, has Iran ever done anything to incite it against the Russian state. It could, easily, but it hasn't armed it, it hasn't encouraged it hasn't given it weapons, no intelligence, nothing. That could change, and if it changed, it would be a disaster for Russia. As the Russian foreign minister, Lavrov, says repeatedly, and nobody listens, we cannot be on the front line of the war you're creating between two civilizations because we are part of that other civilization too. Absolutely true. If we don't like it, blame God. He created that she created that geopolitics. But what is Russia supposed to do? And that's why you see them in this tortured act on the sanctions. Let's do sanctions, but sanctions that don't really get the Iranians mad at us. On the other hand, why don't you all do something really tough and keep them from getting a nuclear weapon? I mean, they don't know what to do. And there's a struggle and a debate in Moscow about this. But they cannot alienate Iran to the point of hostility. They cannot. And that, leaving aside all, everybody says, oh, they get $1 billion for every reactor they build there. Well, they can build reactors for Chavez and for India and for anybody. They don't need that money. They can get it elsewhere. It's the geopolitical danger or non-danger that Iran represents. So this is where America can't make this transition. Yeah, I mean, give the devil his due. Russia's got a problem. We got to figure a way, when we're dealing with Iran, to deal with Russia's problem too. Fourth, and just briefly, missile defense. It's an absolute conflict, has been since Reagan. He called it Star Wars. The reason I say that these make Obama's reset vulnerable is that in the case of missile defense, they wrote the darn conflict right into the prologue of the new treaty, into the preamble. The Russians insisted that there be a passage that says that if the United States pursues missile defense in a way that Moscow perceives as a threat to Russia, Russia can withdraw from the treaty. And the senators who oppose the treaty on that grounds are absolutely right about that anomaly. They're wrong about one thing. They're saying, well, how can you have a treaty where one side threatens to withdraw? Did they forget that in 2002, under Bush, the United States withdrew unilaterally from a much more important treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty? But this is now institutionalized in language in the treaty. So if we push with missile defense, the Russians will withdraw. If we don't, Obama's going to take a beating at home. And finally, but most importantly, and on this I'll end, NATO expansion. Nobody wants to talk about NATO expansion. I had an unpleasant experience yesterday. I went and taped an international affairs television show. And in the middle of the discussion, the host said missile defense. And I said, well, you can't look at missile defense apart from NATO expansion. And he said, I don't want to discuss that. It's a closed subject. It's over. And one thing I learned from being in television for many years is you don't argue with the host. If that's what they want to do, they do it. But that's false. That's wrong. NATO expansion is not over for the Russians. It's a reality. NATO's sitting on its borders. It's not about future NATO expansion. It's about current. NATO expansion represents the following to Russia. And near this I will end. It represents a profoundly broken promise to Russia made by the first Bush that in return for united Germany and NATO, NATO would not expand eastward. This is beyond any dispute. People say, well, they never signed a treaty. But a deal is a deal. The United States gives its word unless we're shysters. And if you don't get it in writing, we'll cheat you. We broke our word. And when both Putin and Medvedev say publicly to Madeleine Albright and others, we, Russia, feel deceived and betrayed, that's what they're talking about. So NATO represents, on the part of Russia, a lack of trust. You break your words to us. To what extent can we trust you? Secondly, it represents military encirclement. If you sit in the Kremlin and you look out at where NATO is and where they want to go, it's everywhere. It's everywhere on Russia's borders. But there's something even more profound that's a taboo in the United States. NATO expansion represents, for the Russians, American hypocrisy and a dual standard. And they see it this way, and I can't think of any way to deny their argument. The expansion of NATO is the expansion of the American sphere of influence. Plain and simple. Where NATO goes, our military force goes. Where NATO goes, our arms munitions go because they have to buy American weapons. Where NATO goes, Western soldiers go who date their women. They bring along their habits and all the other things. It's clearly, undebatably, indisputably, an expansion of America's sphere of influence. So there has been a tremendous expansion of America's sphere of influence since the mid-1990s, right plunk on Russia's borders. All the while, every administration, American administration, saying to Russia, including the Obama administration, you cannot have a sphere of influence because that's old thinking. Well, I mean, the Russians may be cruel, but they're not stupid. In other words, what they say is, we can now have the biggest sphere of influence the world's ever seen, and you don't get any, not even on your own border. In fact, we're taking what used to be your traditional sphere of influence, along with the energy and all the rest. It's ours now. Again, this idea of a winner-take-all policy. This is the enormous resentment in Russia. The relationship will never become a stable cooperative relationship until we deal with this problem. Does it mean Russia's entitled to a sphere of influence? I don't want to speak for Jack Matlock, but Jack thinks yes, depending on what you mean by sphere of influence. They can't occupy countries. We had a Monroe Doctrine. I don't know what that meant. But the point is that until this is worked out, the relationship will never truly be post-Cold War. The problem is it's taboo in America to talk about this issue of who has a sphere of influence, who's entitled to it. I think there are solutions, but you can't even get the question asked. So if you can't get the question on the agenda, you obviously can't come up with an answer. Where I'll stop.